በሚዛናዊነት እንዲሁም በአሳታፊነት የሚንሸራሸርበት ቤት። በሐሳብ ገበታችን ወቅታዊ፣ ማህበራዊ፣ ፖለቲካዊ እንዲሁም የህግ ጉዳዮች በስፋት በጥልቀትና በአካታችነት ይቀርባሉ። የሳምንቱ እንግዳም የሳምንቱ በተጋባዥ የማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች፣ ፖለቲከኞች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች የሚቀርቡበት ፕሮግራም። ወቅታዊ ጉዳይ፣ ወቅታዊ ሀገራዊ ጉዳዮች የሚዳሰሱበት ዝግጅት። የውይይትና የክርክር መድረክ። በተለያየ ጎራ የሚገኙ ታላላቅ ፖለቲከኞች፣ የማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች በሐሳብ ዙሪያ ፊት ለፊት የሚወያዩበት ከዛም አልፎ የሚሟገቱበት ፕሮግራም። ህዝባዊ መድረክ። በተለያዩ ጉዳዮች ላይ ሁሉም የሐሳብ ገበታ ቤተሰቦች በቀጥታ ሐሳባቸውን የሚያቀርቡበትና ተሳታፊ የሚሆኑበት ለቤተሰቦቻችን እድል የምንሰጥበት ጊዜም። እነዚህና ሌሎች ሳምንታዊ ፕሮግራሞችን ለእናንተ እናቀርባለን። ይህንን የተወደደ ቻናል ሰብስክራይብ በማድረግ ቤተሰብ ይሁኑ። በስፋት ተደራሽ እንዲሁም ለሌሎች ያጋሩም። የሐሳብ ገበታው እንዲጠናከር በተሻለ ጥራትና ስፋት ወደ እናንተ እንዲደርስ በሐሳቦ በሙያውና በገንዘቡ ይደግፉን። የሐሳብ ገበታን በሱፐር ቻት፣ በሱፐር ታንክስና በሱፐር ስቲከር አጋርነቱን ያሳዩን። በጎፈንድሚ አማራጭ የሐሳብ ገበታን ያበረታቱ። ስለ ሐሳብ አስተያየቶ እንዲሁም ድጋፎም እናመሰግናለን። ዓላማችን የሐሳብ ማህበረሰብ መፍጠር ነው። የሐሳብ ገበታም
Good morning, good afternoon, good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ethiopia Today special podcast. In today's program, I'm going to talk to Mr. Tom Gardner in regards to understanding Abiy and his project. And our conversation will be based on his recent book, which is very fascinating. I myself have been reading it and I found it very insightful. I hope you would have read it, and if not, I would invite you all to read the book and provide your comments and reviews, and I guarantee you that you will enjoy it. Mr. Tom Gardner has been for almost more than a decade serving as a correspondent for the Economist magazine, which you are all familiar with. But over the last 2 years now, he is the African correspondent for the same magazine since he left or he was expelled from Ethiopia back in 2022. We'll also talk about that in a bit. That said, I would warmly welcome our guest, Mr. Tom Gardner. Welcome to the Buffet of Ideas podcast. It is my pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Marcus. How are you doing?
All good. I hope you are based in Nairobi and all is good, apart from the Gen Z revolution.
Yeah, the Gen Z revolution. Yeah, it's actually it's interesting time to be here. It's like I moved to a new country and there's a protest movement gets started around the same time.
It seems that you are lucky with revolutions, and back in 2016 you were in Ethiopia, and then you found yourself in the middle of a brutal civil war, as we all know, and we are going to discuss it in our today's
Not sure I describe it as lucky, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I don't know why crisis follows you anyways. Let me put it that way. Yeah, that's part of journalism. So you wrote a book which many people found it very, very insightful, and I've read it. It's more than 400 pages, and it's called the Abiy Project, which is displayed on the screen for you, for those of you who are not familiar with it. The Abiy Project, God, Power and War in the New Ethiopia by Tom Gardner. It was just released a month ago. So let me start with a very general stuff, Tom. When did you come across Ethiopia, and what did you find about the people, about the geography, about history and politics in general?
I mean, I first came to Ethiopia in 2016. Actually, just shortly before I came as a journalist, I came to visit, and I did some short reports then. I studied African politics at university, so for my master's, so obviously I was reading about Ethiopia then. And one of the things I'd always found compelling about Ethiopia was this idea of a strong state. Obviously, that is a product of its unique history, which I've always found very, very interesting. But there was this idea well-founded idea in Ethiopian studies of the kind of exceptionalism of the Ethiopian state historically, but also more recently under the EPRDF, and it was basically seen as the strongest state in Africa, or one of the, if not the strongest state in Africa, and also a kind of a standard bearer for industrialization, the developmental state, and all these things which really stood out as very interesting. So I came to Ethiopia with that kind of set of understandings, about Ethiopia's kind of distinct history, its distinct history of state formation, and its exceptionally or uniquely strong state apparatus and developmental vision. The story of kind of the last few years has made me question some of those assumptions, or at least the idea that the state was as strong as we thought, or that the social contract between state and citizens was as strong as I think many outsiders imagined, that the developmental state was as effective or is delivering to the degree that it was kind of touted as delivering. All those kind of assumptions I came to question, and I think there was also a kind of this idea of the political settlement that you heard a lot of at the time, 2016 and later. Abiy Ahmed, the former the chief architect of Ethiopia's industrial strategy, wrote a book made in Africa, which did a lot of stress on this idea of the political Ethiopia's uniquely entrenched and resilient political settlement. And I think those sort of things I came, like everyone, not uniquely insightful here. I mean, everyone realized after 2018, well, actually, this can't be the case, because it's unraveling at a speed that no one saw coming.
Mm. That's great. So yeah, I think you are referring to this book, Made in Africa: Industrial Policy in Ethiopia by Dr. Arkabe Okubai, right? Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that our audience would get. So you came to Ethiopia during one of the most turbulent time in 2016. I myself was there. There was a Cairo movement. Then in the north we have the Fano movement, and in between we have also the different kinds of revolutionary fervor across the country. And then there was a glimpse of hope, I would say, of such a liberal, young, charismatic leader in the name of Abiy Ahmed. And then you left Ethiopia in 2022, and then you have this new book, which we are going to discuss. So the Ethiopia you found in 2016 and the Ethiopia you left behind in 2022. What's the difference between these two versions of Ethiopia?
Well, I mean, the first one, just to kind of follow on from my previous point, is that the state was far weaker than it had been, or had seemed to be, when I arrived in 2016. I mean, the most striking thing that became apparent actually before Abiy comes to power in kind of became very noticeable in 2017 with the conflict between Oromia and the Somali region, was this the weakening of the state's monopoly on violence. And that has been a trend which has just advanced ever kind of almost relentlessly since then. I'm sure we'll come to the state of Ethiopia today later in the conversation, but by 2022, that was obviously very advanced already. The fragmentation of the security apparatus, the social, national, ethnic cleavages were already very everyone knows they were very marked before 2016 and after 2016, but by 2022 that was becoming, frighteningly, these cleavages were coming frighteningly wide. I was very shaken by some of what we were seeing at that time in terms of the social fabric. You had videos on social media, which we've all seen, everyone I'm sure listening to this will have seen, which, just they pointed to or underscored just how badly damaged the social fabric had become over the course of 5-6 years. So that was those were the kind of, I would say, the most obvious standout changes, and relatedly, the economy was, as I said, I don't think the economy was quite as strong as it was touted as being in 2016. But clearly by 2022, when I left, this was off the back of more than a year of war, COVID before that, the Ukraine conflict as well. The economy was in a tailspin. The kind of industrialization, which I mentioned earlier, was also starting to go into reverse. You had factories closing, foreign investors that had played a very big part in the establishment of these major flagship industrial parks like Hawassa were packing up to leave. Mm-hmm. So I didn't leave optimistic, and unfortunately the last 2 years haven't made me reassess that. Despite the silencing of the guns in Tigray, we shouldn't be naive to think that, or complacent to think that the fundamental challenges have been resolved, because they haven't.
That's great. So during your stay there for 6 years, and of course until now, you have not been disassociated from the Ethiopian politics. So after all, you wrote a book just this year, and you are also closely following what is happening in Ethiopia as part of your African correspondence. Did you get enough time to travel to most parts of Ethiopia so that you can get the sense of what the Ethiopia means, its history, and most importantly, to know the social fabric which have been tying the diverse ethno-linguistic people of the country?
Well, I think that would be a lifetime's work to totally to understand all corners of Ethiopia in equal measure. I do think I was able to travel quite widely in the course of my time there at a very kind of historic moment in its history. I was very lucky to be able to do so. It became much harder to travel around the country after 2020. As you know, security in part of the country became very difficult. But I was able. I always kind of, for myself, I put a premium on the importance of traveling as widely as I could in Ethiopia. So I went to all corners. Where I would say I fell short would be some of the peripheral regions, and I don't think I am unique in that, but for probably arguably neglecting the experience of Ethiopia's peripheral regions, Benishangul, Gamela, Afar. I did travel to Afar quite a bit in 2022, but I tried, Benishangul. I went to all of these places. Benishangul was, and that's a conflict that is more undercovered than any, and that was very difficult. I went to Asosa, and I wanted to go to Metakel, and at that point it was far too dangerous, and I was unable to. So yeah, there are going to be limitations to my perspective, and that's something I am upfront about in the book. But I certainly try to travel as widely as possible and spend as much time in the regions which are kind of play the most central role in the narrative which I'm telling in the book.
Yeah, because I was asking this question because it's very important that when you write a book of this magnitude, you must have to have a foundation for the book. And I also really appreciate your humility when you said that you tried your best and the ultimate judgment would rest with Ethiopian people to write their own history. So that is one of the caveats. If I may add one caveat before we even proceed further by taking a liberty, which is in the contemporary Ethiopian political discourse, the Ethiopian elites rarely, if at all, agree on any fundamental issues, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Whatever you write, whatever your perspectives is, even when you produce or adduce some evidence, it would be dismissed as of right. So I think that would be another caveat that I would like to make for anyone who would like to read the book. Even with
I kind of convey that in the book. I think one of the I cite a particular example of that. Obviously, I have a whole chapter devoted to competing accounts of history, and I think that's sort of pretty fundamental before you go any further to acknowledge that these are kind of fiercely contradictory or competitive narratives of Ethiopian national history and state formation. But also specifically in the case of the transition, I cite the example of the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa in 2020, in June 2020, as an example of how, without almost any agreed upon facts, what you had is just a complete divergence of narratives around a single incident, which will never be agreed upon, I don't think. I mean, I don't think there'll be a serious investigation, and I don't know if there will ever be presented with more evidence at this point. But I say, in a sense, like Hachalu's death was an example of how one incident, where you stand on that incident, was often very, very telling of your positions on, or your views on the kind of narrative of the transition, where it went wrong, who was responsible, and they were ultimately often completely contradictory. So I tried to flag in that being one key example of just how divergent opinions, yes, among elites. We often are talking about elite opinions, I suppose, of Ethiopia's kind of politics and history, just how contradictory they are.
Yeah, so the civil war just added additional layer to that. We're going to the thick of it in a moment, but before we leave this section, let me ask you, I read on the Economist itself, which is a very short report about the reason behind your expulsion. It is not that much detailed. You also provided somehow in the new book. If you share with our audience why you were expelled from Ethiopia, and then I will have a follow-up question once you
sure.
share.
Yeah, I didn't write the article about press freedom, which noted my expulsion, because obviously I was part of that story, so I didn't write that. I wrote a personal story about about my experience being expelled. It was a long time coming, I felt at the time. During the course of the war, it was a difficult time to be any journalist, I think, in Ethiopia, foreign media in particular. There was, a huge amount of grievance around the coverage of the war, which, as I point out in the book, some of it fair, some of it not fair. I, was one of the prominent journalists on the ground at the time. We were writing, the economists were writing, stuff that was critical of the government. So I wasn't massively surprised that at some point it would become hard to remain in the country. This is not unique to Ethiopia, nor is it unique to the particular regime in Ethiopia at the time. I mean, it was difficult to cover previous conflicts in Ethiopian history as a foreign correspondent. I don't think this one was particularly exceptional in that regard. Those who were following it at the time, there was a whole incident around a report written by a Canadian academic about Tigray, which has now been removed, actually. It's been removed from the line because it didn't get ethical clearances. So it was a kind of controversial paper, which I privately had expressed my misgivings about. That got leaked to some social media activists, who then, started a campaign to have me deported, which lasted about 2 weeks, and then I was expelled. But as I said, that was the kind of, from my point of view, that was the proximate cause. It was a long time coming, and it wasn't a great surprise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even in your own book, as you said, even in your own book on page 303, you said foreign reporting was indeed sometimes sloppy. That is I think this is fairly balanced. So if I pick up on that, don't you think that some of the concerns by the Ethiopian citizen as well as the government were justified, given that most of the reputable international news magazines, including the economists, were not balanced to use the accusation of the government? Are they not justified?
It would be specific allegations and specific stories, I think, were not possibly always dealt with in a totally balanced way. I mean, I think in some of the footnotes I provide a couple of examples of stories where I thought this was sloppy. In terms of the bigger picture, in terms of where international coverage of the war was on issues like the human rights abuses, and where the government was on the question of human rights abuses, I don't think the government's position was valid. I think it was understandable that it would defend itself in that way. I think it was on the facts wrong. But I also, as I said, acknowledged in the book, there were certain allegations which weren't correct, and I think maybe that reflected a lack of subject expertise among certain media, sensationalism, or kind of predilection or an instinct to sensationalism. But again, on the bigger picture, on the question of like the humanitarian crisis or the human rights crisis during the war, I think the media was broadly correct.
Great. So now you had been expelled in 2022, and your book came out in 2024, and I think you finished up the final version of the book around March of this year. Do you think that if you were not expelled from Ethiopia, you would have written a different version of the book, or your expulsion has not somehow shrouded your objectivity in writing the book and making some arguments?
No, I mean the arguments I make in the book and the analyses I make in the book are broadly, there's no real change. I mean, you can see what I wrote in articles before and after, and there isn't I don't think I've changed. I mean, maybe on certain specifics where evidence has emerged, maybe it would be different, but no, I don't think so. I think what did change, because the book contract actually came out. I signed a contract to write a book in 2019.
Oh, okay.
That was a very different book, and at that time it was, it was about. I mean, it was always meant to be a book about the transition, because I was there and I felt I was, had a kind of relatively front row seat and was very privileged to be in the country at that time, documenting what was happening, and I wanted to, I had notebooks filled with reporting which didn't make it into articles, and this is a common gripe of journalists, that they have done all this reporting and then you write a story for your newspaper, and it ends up being much less nuanced or comprehensive than you would have liked. And so I knew from quite early on, like, I'm not satisfied doing what I'm doing with my kind of day job, and I want to write. I want to have an outlet for the work I've been doing, and I want to be able to chronicle this extraordinarily historic and tumultuous period in Ethiopian history properly. So I had an approach to publisher about that from 2019, end of 2019, and that book was obviously not a book about a war. It was a book about the transition, which at that point, yes, I knew was going wrong, but I didn't know how wrong. It was also, at this point, I said it was a book about the transition. It wasn't at that point a book about Abiy. And I know a lot of people refer to it as a biography of Abiy. It isn't a biography of Abiy. I've tried to make that clear. I look forward to a full biography of him, like written, by a historian or by a biographer at some point. The book is always meant to be a chronicle of the transition. What happened in the course of writing it predominantly over the course of 2023 was that I decided to kind of narrow the focus a little bit by honing in on the figure of Abiy, for reasons which we can go into. I have to, at some point you have to try and organize thinking and your analysis and narrative, and I chose that organizing principle to be the figure of Abiy himself.
So so your beef, if I may say, or your fractious relationship with Abiy as a person, and for explaining you from the country, has not impacted your writing about him, not about the whole book about
no, I
didn't.
I didn't see that in particularly personal terms. I had the whole thing. I wasn't the only journalist that was expelled, and I wasn't the only foreigner to be expelled. And I didn't take it in a particularly personal way at all. The impetus, anyway, didn't come. Maybe it came from Abiy. I don't know. But maybe the ultimate decision came from Abiy. But I don't know. What I know is the impetus came from abroad, and it was then picked up, I think, locally. But I don't have a particular person.
Yes.
I don't know if Abiy thinks much about me.
He thinks in an oblivious way. So let's go to the early period of the transition itself, as which is part of the first 3-4 chapters of your book, and you described it Abiymania. Okay, so those period of Abiymania where most of the international community got Abiy wrong, including yourself, which you have admitted on page 4. You said that the argument that you made in the foreign policy turned out to be wrong. So why the international community, including yourself and most of the Ethiopians, got Abiy wrong?
Well, I just to caveat that, yes, I do offer a mea culpa, but I was also pretty critical of the trajectory of the transition from actually earlier even than that article, when we saw mass arrests in Addis in September 2018 after the incidents in Piazza and Brai, after the return of the OLF. So I was writing critical stuff at that point. I never felt I was swept up in the Abiymania, but I understand where that sentiment came from, and I think it's problematic. But there was I think much the kind of, and I'll speak kind of here about the West because the international community, including, let's say China or other parts of the country, their relationship with Abiy was very different. But the West, and particularly America, I think in a very broad sense, projected onto Abiy this idea of a kind of liberal Democrat, saw in him what they wanted to see. This was at a time where particularly among kind of liberals, there was a feeling globally that the world was I don't think this has changed, but the world was kind of falling apart, and democracy was in retreat in so much of the world, from America to Europe, and including in Africa. So I think there was this Abiy kind of tapped into, I think quite sort of shrewdly, and I think consciously as well, tapped into this kind of this desire internationally to see someone to kind of latch onto a kind of good news story. And sometimes when it comes to the media, I think it can genuinely be as simplistic as that. Now, of course, there were other reasons as well for the US. As I write in the book, this was Trump administration. The priority had become great power competition with China. Abiy positioned himself not just as a Democrat, kind of appealing to the people in the State Department and the EU who love that stuff. My own paper, I guess, as well. But they were very concerned at that point in Trump's White House about beating back China, and Abiy sort of Abiy very, I think, consciously exploited that. He, and I report this in the book, he would say to the American embassy, I basically don't like the Chinese or the Chinese Communist Party. I see them as godless and Marxist, and that's something that he definitely has a problem with. So I think there were, the particular moment at which he comes to power was propitious for him to kind of galvanize the international community around him as a Democrat, but also when it comes to the Trump administration as a pro-Western, warrior in the new Cold War. That didn't last that long, as we all know, but that was the way he positioned himself. And I think, and I quote the US ambassador comes under, at the time, Mike Rayner comes under a bit of fire in my book, because I think he was a bit guileless and naive, but he described Abiy to other diplomats, the most pro-Western leader we're going to get. So there was a lot of kind of blindness towards the burying heads in the sand, towards the clear warning signs after 2019 as to what really was going on in the country, because everyone, at least, and again, I'm just speaking about the West, everyone had kind of invested in this idea. I mean, it had gone to the point of giving him a Nobel Prize. So there was another diplomat, European diplomat, said there was egg on the face, meaning everyone had kind of gone to such lengths to endorse, embrace, and empower this guy that they were not that there was a kind of shame or reluctance to admit making mistakes.
Sorry, yeah. So they even went on to award him as recent as this year the Agricola Prize, which is prestigious as well. I think there is something either fundamentally lacking from the part of the West, or perhaps Abiy is also doing something which is catching the attention of the international community. Either ways, there must be something missing.
The Agricole case, I think, requires more investigation, because I certainly heard some allegations around corruption in the awarding of that particular prize. It was very weird, that one. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just saying also, because it's also included in around the last part of your book, that even in 2024, as we speak, he just won this year another prize, so which is not so surprising. So who is Abiy again? Because I'm asking you that right around the beginning, you said Abiy is not like any typical modern dictator or authoritarian, and then in your last chapter, you also said Abiy is still different. He's not a typical modern day strong man. So who is Abiy for you? And I think I described Abiy. I don't know whether you read it or not. I wrote a charming dictator article for the Ethiopian Insight last year, in which one of the arguments that we made is strikingly similar in terms of the modern technique and the social media and all those photo apps. But who is Abiy for you? So if he's not authoritarian, if he's not Democrat, if he's not liberal, who is he?
Well, I don't say he's not authoritarian. I mean, he obviously is authoritarian. He slightly confounds that particular definition by virtue of the fact that he likes to present himself as a kind of Democrat in a way that's quite unusual. Putin, and I also compare him to Putin at points, right? Putin does not describe himself as a Democrat. Xi Jinping spends most of the Chinese Communist Party advances a ideological critique of liberal democracy. What I find, and I made this point in the book, it's not a centerpiece of my argument, but I do find it interesting. I flag it. I do find it interesting that Abiy doesn't lean into those arguments. He continues to, and his administration continue to present themselves, claim that they are Democrats, which I find quite interesting. That's why I say he doesn't quite fit the strongman mold. And what I do throughout the book is try to convey just how much he confounds and contradicts. He doesn't quite fit the established categories that we have, or anywhere in the world or in Ethiopia for a leader. I mean, he's not straightforwardly a kind of an authoritarian dictator, though he has those tendencies. He's not a Democrat in the kind of conventional sense. He's certainly not a liberal Democrat, which I confess at the start of the book to saying once that he might be. Neither does he quite fit the established categories of Ethiopian politics, Ethiopianist or ethno-nationalist or Roman nationalist. He is he has this kind of religious quality to him as well, the messianic quality. So he eludes easy categorization, and that's the point I make, very clearly at the start of the book. I think that will be probably frustrating to many people reading it, in the sense that I too, embarked on this project wanting to know who is Abiy and exactly, how can we define him, and found myself kind of constantly confounded by the guy. He doesn't quite fit these expectations, and that's one of the points I make in the book, and in the epilogue as well. I kind of lay out the different Abiys. He is this kind of figure who seems to have multiple faces. I think other people have said this as well. There are Ethiopian commentators who have made this point. In fact, I think
the many faces of Abiy, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
There was
so
an
he has many faces, which means he doesn't. So so it is hard to say, to pin him down. However, one of the arguments I do make in the book is that I do think he has some kind of vision, and this is possibly one of the more controversial arguments. I've heard a lot of Ethiopians push back against this, say he is simply a dictator, or simply a kind of strong man pursuing personal enrichment, manipulating and co-opting and dividing in order to stay in power. I think part of that's part of the story, but I do think, and I try to show this in the book, and I understand there will be people who disagree, but I try to show through the book that there is a kind of a reasonably consistent thread in terms of some of the ideas which he articulates from quite early on in his career until today. A lot of this is, the stuff around prosperity and mindset, and kind of self-help. Those kind of core ideas, and even the idea of Ethiopia, like make Ethiopia is a great country, that sort of stuff. I think you can see this consistently through his writings, though he is also adept and at deploying different rhetoric and different arguments at different times in a way which can confound. But I do make the argument. I make the argument that he has a vision of some sorts. It's not a clear policy program. It's not an rigorously ideological one, but there is a kind of an orientation towards the world that I think is quite distinctly his. And I think that in that respect, that's one of the cool things I try to highlight in the book.
Yes, so it's related to this very point. That I remember one of the commentator on Ethiopian politics. I think he is Dr. Awul Qasim. Early on in 2019, he said Abiy is trying to bring back make Ethiopia great again. So is this mega project or making Ethiopia great again part of Abiy's vision? Do you see any salience in that?
I don't think that's completely. I don't dismiss that argument at all. Actually, I think that is. I don't think it is. I think the limitations of that analysis lay in the fact that it was at the time articulated in a kind of explicitly ethnic frame, like it was, the discourse at that point was all around the kind of revival of the neo-Neftenia state. It was seen as a kind of as an Amhara project to make Ethiopia great again. As I try and show in the book, Abiy he's not just simply an Amhara nationalist or an Ethiopianist trying to revive the old Amharic-centered state. There is no indication that he wants to make Ethiopia, exclusively Amharic speaking, for example, that sort of stuff, which was very salient as a discourse in 2020. I think that's what Awul was sort of alluding to at that time. In that point, I don't quite think that's quite correct. I don't think Abiy's vision of a kind of Ethiopia is quite so narrow. He does draw upon, his Oromo heritage as well, and I talk about that in the book about how he's sort of tried to incorporate a sort of Oromo nationalism and assimilate it with Ethiopian nationalism. Critics will say that's nonsensical or it doesn't work, but he has explicitly said that's what he's trying to do.
Can we consider it as a sort of pragmatism, or is he just trying to manipulate the fault lines?
This is the core paradox, the problem, I think, with understanding Abiy. As I say, I do believe there is a vision here that he wants to and sees himself as within a prophetic tradition, sent by God to make Ethiopia great again, or to deliver Ethiopia into prosperity. I think he sees that as his purpose, for sure. But I don't think, sorry, what was your point again? Your question again?
I was saying, because the Prosperity Party announces that they are pragmatists when it comes to political theory, philosophy, and most people are saying, no, you are just being footloose or amoeba, having no shape.
Sorry, so yeah, there's the vision part about delivering Ethiopia to prosperity, and then this other side to his politics, which is cynical, manipulative. I have someone I quote in the book, someone who spent a lot of time with him, describing him as the manipulator in chief. I think almost any Ethiopian would agree with that, in the sense that he does clearly manipulate the fault lines in Ethiopian politics to stay in power. I think that the fundamental kind of problematic that I identify is, yes, he's sort of this. He is at once this kind of cynical Machiavellian politician scheming to stay in power, but he's also got this kind of elevated idea of destiny and the kind of Ethiopia that he wants to build. How you reconcile those two traits, I find, that for me is the thing that's most the most inscrutable in a way. I mean, I think he believes that he must stay in power because only he is able to govern Ethiopia and to deliver it to the promised land. So that's possibly how he reconciles the two. But yes, I think there is a cynicism. I also think there is this kind of more elevated idealism. Pragmatism is a slightly different question. I think he has demonstrated pragmatism at times, and I mentioned it. And this is something I argue in the final chapter of the book when I talk about the Pretoria Agreement. I do think that was he did make certain concessions and compromises. I know this from speaking to the mediators about specific moments in which he changed his position in order to allow for a deal. Whether was he also cynical at the same time, expecting that he would be able to delay or move the goalposts after the fact, possibly. But he has shown a degree at moments of pragmatism, which I think was interesting to me in 2022, having seen him over the course of 2021, whereas we all saw he was in this kind of messianic mold or messianic moment where it seemed that he was immune to any of the pressures on him to change tack and to enter into negotiations.
We'll come back to Abiy on our final concluding remarks, but before that, let's address a couple of questions, because once you are here without talking about the Tigray war, it would be quite unforgiving. So you also discussed throughout the book about the competing ethno-nationalism, and at one point you even likened the Amhara ethno-nationalism to the Serbian, the last days of Serbian nationalism before the fateful disintegration of Yugoslavia as we know it. So what is so unique about Amhara nationalism, apart from being reactionary to some of the things that you have described about constant persecutions and being labeled for different things that all the ills that befell Ethiopia, as well as the narratives which depicts the Amhara people as being the chief architect of the Ethiopian empire, and the list goes on. So what is so unique about the Amhara nationalism? And if someone asks you, actually somebody asked us today in the chat that it seems that you are biased towards the Amhara nationalists and the Ethiopianist camp by exonerating all other ethno-nationalists and not attributing any accountability or responsibility. That is one of the questions asked from our follower.
Okay. What I tried to do in the book is I make the point that Amhara nationalism not totally dissimilar from Tigrayan nationalism, Oromo nationalism, or even, let's say, Eritrean nationalism. I mean, all nationalisms have their kind of foundational traumas, their narratives of victimhood. I don't think Amhara is particularly exceptional in that regard. What I point to, and I think this was of particular relevance in the course of the Tigray War, was irredentism. There are Amhara nationalists who are, I've seen describing themselves as Amhara irredentists, not even Amhara nationalists. Irredentism is for me, that's the kind of distinctive element to it, and that's why in the course of the war in Tigray, it became particularly dangerous. So the Western Tigray or Wolkite case being the key thing, and that obviously I have a whole chapter to that in the book, devoted to that in the book, because I think for me, from my reading of and my reporting, I thought it was the most extreme case of kind of nationalism, kind of violent nationalist uprising. But I don't think I point to the kind of absolutist edge in Oromo nationalism. I write about at various points in the book, the targeting of Amharas in all parts of the country, but particularly in Oromia, the kind of intolerance towards minority groups in Oromia. I document that as well, and the kind of exceptionalism of Tigrayan nationalism, which is a part of my account of the road to war in the chapter about the kind of the months preceding November 2020. So yeah, I do point to a distinctive element in Amhara nationalism, which I think does make it stand out, and we see this in the course of what happened in Western Tigray. But I'm also totally. I acknowledge throughout the book the dangers inherent in competing nationalisms. None of which are kind of spotless by any stretch.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of the war, it is quite understandable, and I also appreciate the level with which you meticulously tried to collect the evidence and all the footnotes, extensive footnotes speaks to that. But even apart, outside the context of the war, at one point you even alluded to the fact that the Amhara nationalism is expansionist in essence, in a sense, that saying, you said, for example, the Oromos to some extent also claim Addis Ababa and some other part, and the Tigrayans, but you said that is not the essence of other nationalism. But when it comes to the Amhara nationalism, there's only expansionist in the country. And I would say that every ethno-nationalist, by definition, is expansionist, right? As much as possible, and if the environment is conducive, then you will go and grab as much land as possible within the Ethiopian context. So
I think there's an element of truth to that. It wasn't, in terms of the way they articulate their agenda, there is none of the other nationalist groups do so as explicitly as the Amhara nationalist can when it comes to the whole list of territories which are, and you may argue, well, or one may argue, well, that's because they were particularly disadvantaged or unfairly treated by the drawing of the map in 1991, or maybe, I think more likely, because of land shortage in the Amhara highlands. And I mentioned this in the book, the economic basis of this, which is the land shortage, lack of productive farmland in the Amhara highlands. This is, that's one of the reasons why Amharas migrated from the highlands in the first place. This is a fundamental structural constraint.
But doesn't that also even strongly apply to Tigrayans when it comes to the land shortage or a shortage of resource? Because there is where you find an acute shortage of farmland.
It does. The Amhara nationalist program is much more explicit about territorial expansion in the sense of, it's not just Wolkite, it was also Raya, it was also Al-Fashka, it was also Metekel, there was parts of Shoa. I think I struggle to see that explicit articulation in other movements, but I also understand to the roots of that, and I try in the book to explain these grievances as well. The other reason I think is also important to acknowledge is, in addition to land shortage, is the vulnerabilities of Amhara communities outside of the Amhara homeland, quote unquote homeland. And this is, by the way, why I make the comparison to Serbian nationalism, because that also had the problem of vulnerable minorities beyond the borders of the regional state, where yes, they are absolutely, targets for discrimination or even much worse, ethnic cleansing. So the idea of needing to expand the borders in order to protect Amhara, that's part of the story as well.
So with that, let's move to the Tigray war, or the brutal civil war in the northern part of Ethiopia, which have lasted for more than 2 years, and basically have appended most of what Ethiopia stood for. What are the major structural causes of the war, Tom? Because your reasons are scattered throughout the book, but if somebody has to ask you about the major structural causes of the war, not about the trigger, because you said what happened to the Northern Command is not even a trigger. That's what you said. That's how you argued in the book. So then what are the structural causes or fault lines?
The war was going to happen regardless of what happened on November the 4th. We could go back.
But you said it was not inevitable, right? At the same time.
Yeah, I do. At the same time. In the sense that decisions were made after 2018, and you've read that chapter, I blame is not, I don't exclusively pin it on Abiy here. I think decisions were made by different actors in Tigray and Eritrea and in Addis to escalate. If you go back further, we can go back to much further to the kind of national question. I think ultimately, if it was simply, as many people have said, a power struggle between Abiy and the TPLF, then an elite pact or a bargain struck in Pretoria would have resolved Ethiopia's conflict. Of course, that's not what's happened. Ultimately, these are at roots are more fundamental questions about what kind of country this is, and yes, the constitution, the structure of the federation, which is also a question of power as well. Ideology, constitutionalism, law, all of this, it is also a question of power and resources and who gets what, and that ultimately, if we're talking really big picture, that is where this, the roots of this lie. More kind of to make it a little bit less grand, yes, the problems begin with the exit, let's say, of the TPLF from the kind of pinnacle of power in 2018, and the failure to ultimately there wasn't a political settlement at this point. What happened was a kind of implicit or a tacit bargain struck between Abiy and other members of the EPRDF, which allowed for Abiy to come into power and a kind of handover power between generations and between ethnicities. The problem was it was never clear what exactly the terms were, and this point I'm very critical as well of Abiy, because he came to power with quite a limited mandate in terms of from his coalition colleagues as to what was to be he was to pursue, and he ended up quite quickly sort of personalizing the transition, pursuing quite an idiosyncratic, personalized project in a way which failed to address the kind of, I would say, structural challenges. One of which was, what do you do with an exiting elite, a minority elite as well, which had particular fears and particular, yes, also interests. In some cases, maybe ambitions. Although obviously in the book I I'm not particularly convinced by the idea that there was a kind of scheme to return to kind of to dominance in Addis, but certainly there were fears and interests. Abiy did not deal with those wisely at all, and it's not the case that there was no one kind of advising him to do otherwise, because he was being advised to do otherwise by people very, very close to him, including Gedu, including Lema, and then outside the party as well, from people from Jawa and elsewhere, saying, this is a really dangerous fault line in the politics of this country. It needs to be dealt with very, very, very carefully, and he plowed ahead anyway. And so, in that respect, I'm very critical of the way he handled that. So, I guess in terms of how I understand the war, I do see it as a kind of dangerously mismanaged transition, where war was not inevitable, was not the inevitable outcome. It was a highly likely one, given the challenges of Ethiopia as a state and nation, the national question that go back decades, if not longer, and then the more short-term or more immediate challenges of a transition, which involved, managing the fears and ambitions and interests of a particular group as another group took the reins. And in that respect, Abiy was and of course the buck stops with him for that.
Yeah, just within the causes of the war, it come up time and again that you were using the clash of ideology, in a sense, that between more centralized unitary state and the other federalist force. I found that very difficult to swallow, because nowhere Abiy or his colleagues have ever said that they are going to change the structure of the federation or overhaul the constitutional system. So what is that ideological difference? Because Abiy generally inherited all the structural part of the constitutional order, including the federation. They never attempted to do anything with the federation. So where does that, there is a narrative which I'm aware of, but factually speaking, is there that clash between the two groups?
There is a hypocrisy on the part of Abiy's critics in this regard, particularly the TPLF, in the sense that, when they were in Addis Ababa, power was centralized despite the letter of the constitutional law. But I don't subscribe to the view that Abiy has no intention to change the constitution. My reporting, and I document this in various points in the book, in particular the chapter Medema, but the transformation of the EPRDF into the Prosperity Party is indicative of that. He does want a different constitutional or federal arrangement. Now,
but that is within the existing constitutional order. There is no contradiction of having a multinational single party, and because there is no inherent contradiction, because it is in line with the existing.
There's no reason why you can't have a single party in a rather than a coalition. And I say that explicitly, by the way. Again, in Medema, in that chapter, I say explicitly. My point was about the way it was, the fears that were widespread and I don't think entirely unwarranted, that it was the thin end of the wedge to transform the EPRDF into the Prosperity Party was a thin end of the wedge before the, ultimately the inevitable, as it was seen, restructuring of the constitutional order. Did that happen in the end? Not yet. And I think, to go back to the point about Abiy's pragmatism, I think that he has, to some degree, seen that to kind of radically overhaul the constitution is kind of impossible, particularly these days when he is more dependent politically than he was before on the Oromo component of the Prosperity Party, who don't, as a rule, don't want to change the kind of, at least the legal framework of the constitution too dramatically. I think that is, I do think, and I think I lay out the reasoning in the book. I do think that is part of Abiy's project is to change the federal arrangements from one that is described variously as ethnic federalism or multinational federalism into something more akin to geographic federalism, and we can see that with the way that the southern region has been
restructured.
I mean, there are plenty of people, we'll say that's a very, reasonable thing to do. And I don't actually in the book say it isn't. My point is that that was the trajectory as seen by, the TPLF and also, Oromo opponents. I don't think it was wrong of them to think that that was the goal in mind, and ultimately, therefore, this is what I refer to as this clash of ideological visions. So I do think there was. I absolutely do think there is a different. There is a fundamentally different idea of what Ethiopia is and how it's best organized, even if in practice the way the different groups govern may not be as necessarily quite so different.
Oh, yeah, at least we agree on the perception of it, because perceptions also really matter in the political decision. Yeah. So with that, let's go to the scar of war. For the sake of time, we only have 10 minutes. So what is the scar of war? Because when we started, we say that the social fabric has been torn apart due to the civil war, which has basically an all-out, it has an ethnic nature for sure, no matter how we try to describe it otherwise. So what is the scar of war for the future of Ethiopia? And do you even see that scar somehow dissipate in due course?
I mean, Ethiopians will know better than me what the scars of war are. I mean, from where I see it, the mutual suspicion between different groups is at a degree that I think, it goes beyond what was, current before the war. I think it's dangerously advanced these days. The idea of, whether it's Amharas and Tigrayans or Oromos and Amharas, the kind of suspicion of each other has become, very dangerous, and that's why we see these proliferating conflicts. I also think, what I think is really concerning is the kind of desensitization to not just suffering of other groups, and that sort of is part of what the point I just made, but also just the kind of numbing effect of the cumulative weight of recurrent violence over so many years now. I'm writing a piece this week about this epidemic of kidnapping. These things, whether it's kidnapping or just political assassinations, localized ethnic conflicts, these things have become so routine that often it doesn't make even local news. That I think it should be very worrying, in the sense that violence has become too much a part of daily life, particularly outside of Addis. And that's the kind of impact on the social fabric. That's what I'm referring to, really. I think at the end of the book, where I talk about the damage.
Is there a room for reconciliation? And do you have any hope in the ongoing national dialogue to fix any of?
I don't think it's going to be a surprise to you or anyone that I'm not massively convinced by the national dialogue. A national dialogue which hasn't got the buy-in of the key groups, political groups, or which is seen as being too much steered by the government, and where chief demands such as, or controversial demands, let's say, such as a transitional government, are dismissed outright even before the process begins by the incumbent, clearly doesn't bode well for a national dialogue where everything is on the table and all groups act as, come to the table as equal participants. So I'm not saying anything that you or any of your readers listeners will have not heard before when I say that about the national dialogue. I mean, it has been widely criticised, and I think rightly so. Can reconciliation happen? I mean, there are countries, there are many examples around the world of a kind of country of different groups which have been torn apart by violence, kind of gradually reaching some sort of modus vivendi or even genuine reconciliation. I don't think these things are impossible, and I hope the book ends on a note of hope in that regard, because I do think so much of this is not exclusively. I mean, it was a mass violence. It wasn't just led by elites. It had mass participation, but of course, a lot of it is a problem of elites, and there are many millions of Ethiopians who have not participated in any way, any shape or form, who have done, who want reconciliation, who want, anywhere in the world, want peace and stability, and I think that is obviously, and that therein lies the possibility for hope and reconciliation. So I don't believe it's impossible at all. I think it's very difficult because it's still very raw, and there hasn't been a serious step towards the kind of accountability and truth and acknowledgement and all of that you need before reconciliation. But of course, it's possible. Let's hope for the best. So looking ahead, where is Ethiopia and Abiy is heading in the future? Because your book ended, of course, in 2024. Abiy and Ethiopia will outlast the book, and that is what you made around the end of the book. And I quote that you said, Ethiopia in 2024 embodies what has been called the polycrisis of our present age. So do you see a sort of political automatic stabilizer? Because in economics, there is automatic stabilizer, a macroeconomic policy where you have to unleash some kind of economic mechanisms. But what can we do? What do you want the international community to see or to do? What sort of intervention as we look ahead with Ethiopia and Abiy? I don't know about interventions, but I think
when I said I'm referring just policy intervention, not international intervention.
Well, I mean, I think there needs to be, as I said, much more effort internationally to at least encourage the government and its opponents to sit for a serious negotiation about the future of the country. I don't think that is going to happen, though. I mean, I think my policy prescriptions I don't think I add most value there. What I would say is, when it comes to my analysis of where Ethiopia is at now, Abiy is quite secure in his position, relatively speaking, certainly compared to 2021 and parts of 2022. I think it has reached a sort of equilibrium, at least it seems like it now, where violence is relatively decentralized. It's fragmented. It's not organized in any way that threatens Abiy. There is a whole political economy around conflict in the regions, Oromia, Amhara, and Tigray now as well. None of this is good for kind of long-term prosperity or stability, but it seems to me that there's a certain kind of steady state of where everyday violence is normalized. You have these horrific incidents like these abduction of 100 students just the other week, which are kind of terrifyingly regular, but they don't fundamentally disrupt the balance in terms of power in the country. And I think from Abiy's perspective, he's not under serious pressure. I think in the longer term, there are things for him to be concerned about. One is the economy. So we'll see soon whether there is an IMF program, $10.5 billion, that's a big sum. Whether that will provide any kind of lasting resolution to Ethiopia's economic challenges, I'm sure is a topic for another conversation. The army, which is now bogged down in conflicts in Amhara, in Oromia, and with potentially facing threats in the region. Ethiopia has not had a coup, as you know, since 1974. It may not, you can't rule that out. I think Abiy has managed to build a certain loyalty to himself within the institution. It's a very militarized state now, Ethiopia and the Prosperity Party, but that may not last. So those are kind of factors to be aware, for him to be considerate, to be aware of, I suppose. Regionally as well, the conflicts or dispute with Somalia. It's improving relations with Sudan, clearly, judging by that recent visit to Port Sudan. But Sudan is now a failing state, and that may spill over into Ethiopia. So there's all sorts of unknowns as well, which makes prediction very dangerous. But I think in the kind of immediate short term, I don't think Abiy is necessarily losing much sleep over the prospect of losing power. And that's the note I conclude on in the book. And I leave it to, I don't really leave it. I don't really leave it to the reader to decide. I do make clear that I think it is not for the best for Ethiopia. I think one man's vision and his kind of ruthless pursuit of it is not the best path for a complex country like Ethiopia, and probably not the right path for any country, but I definitely don't think for Ethiopia.
That's great. Given the limited time we have, that brings us to our today's discussion, and we won't stop here. As you said, we will discuss about other issues. Since now I have read the book entirely, I might try to write some review whenever I find some time. I also invite everybody to read this book, which is extensively researched. Whether you agree with the argument Tom is making or not, still you would benefit by reading the book. So please try to read the book. And it is called The Abiy Project. You can see it on the screen here. It is published on the Hearst publisher, I think. So Abiy Project, God, Power and War in the New Ethiopia by Tom Gardner. I thank you very much, Tom, for your time and for your perspective.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate it. Thanks for reading the book. Thanks for engaging with it. I enjoyed discussing it, and I hope people read it, and whether they agree or don't, take something from it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure having you, and good night. Until next time. So this is our Ethiopia Today podcast. Our today's guest is Tom Gardner, the author of The Abiy Project, God, Power and War in the New Ethiopia. The book raises so many controversial issues with which I personally may not agree. But since we had a very limited time for today, which is maximum 75 minutes, we agreed. We have to leave it here, but we'll pick up from where we stopped today, and hopefully we'll see you next time in a very short period of time. And we wish all the best and have a nice weekend. And we'll see you on Sunday.
የሐሳብ ገበታ ሐሳብ ያለ ልዩነት ሚዛናዊነት እንዲሁም በአሳታፊነት የሚንሸራሸርበት ቤት። በሐሳብ ገበታችን ወቅታዊ፣ ማህበራዊ፣ ፖለቲካዊ እንዲሁም የህግ ጉዳዮች በስፋት በጥልቀትና በአካታችነት ይቀርባሉ። የሳምንቱ እንግዳም የሳምንቱ ለተጋባዥ ማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች፣ ፖለቲከኞች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች የሚቀርቡበት ፕሮግራም ወቅታዊ ጉዳይ፣ ወቅታዊ ሀገራዊ ጉዳዮች የሚዳሰሱበት ዝግጅት፣ የውይይትና የክርክር መድረክ፣ በተለያየ ጎራ የሚገኙ ታላላቅ ፖለቲከኞች፣ የማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች በሐሳብ ዙሪያ ፊት ለፊት የሚወያዩበት ከዛም አልፎ የሚሟገቱበት ፕሮግራም፣ ህዝባዊ መድረክ፣ የተለያዩ ጉዳዮች ላይ ሁሉም የሐሳብ ገበታ ቤተሰቦች በቀጥታ ሐሳባቸውን የሚያቀርቡበትና ተሳታፊ የሚሆኑበት ቤተሰቦቻችን እድል የምንሰጥበት ጊዜም። እነዚህና ሌሎች ሳምንታዊ ፕሮግራሞችን ለእናንተ እናቀርባለን። ይህንን የተወደደ ቻናል ሰብስክራይብ በማድረግ ቤተሰብ ይሁኑ፣ በስፋት ተደራሽ እንዲሁም ለሌሎች ያጋሩም። የሐሳብ ገበታው እንዲጠናከር በተሻለ ጥራትና ስፋት ወደ እናንተ እንዲደርስ በሐሳቦ በሙያውና በገንዘቡ ይደግፉን። የሐሳብ ገበታን በሱፐር ቻት፣ በሱፐር ታንክስና በሱፐር ስቲከር አጋርነቱን ያሳዩን። በጎፈንድሚ አማራጭ የሐሳብ ገበታን ያበረታቱ። ስለ ሐሳብ አስተያየቶ እንዲሁም ድጋፎም እናመሰግናለን። ዓላማችን የሐሳብ ማህበረሰብ መፍጠር ነው። የሐሳብ ገበታም